There's this story just in classic literature. It's expressed itself in many different ways, but essentially it starts like this. There's a person who begins as like a peasant or a slave, the person at the bottom of society somehow, or it would have been servants of some kind to like the upper class. But this idea in storytelling has shown up in like a really profoundly exciting way, especially right now at this point in our history. This expresses the human story. It tells the story of humanity personified in a single individual, a hero or heroine in the story, who essentially is born in the kind of reverse position to who they actually are. And they don't know it. They don't know, for example, their inborn royalty. They don't know because they were raised by servants, because they were raised by people who were of a lesser standing of some kind, lesser skill, lesser knowledge, lesser wealth, always less, always lacking then in some sort. But because the story is so powerful and existing in such a physical way, it has to have a very physical kind of wealth. The person has to be born of noble blood. The person has to be like a king who was hidden for some reason. There is a child born of, I think it was like Hebrew descent, who was found while floating down a river, and he was put into a basket with some of the original Hebrew cloth of his origin. And this becomes the proof to him later on that he is in fact of a lesser born stature, because it is royalty that finds him and that raises him as one of their own. The daughter of the royal house or whatnot lies and says that she had this child. And so Moses is raised in this family, raised to be a king essentially. But at a certain point, his true identity comes forward. And the truth of him is, he's like a beggar. He's no better than any of those like poor villagers out there who come from little knowledge, little wealth, little land, and little experience in life. But because Moses is true, he finds it within himself to leave. But when he comes back to his people, he brings with him the knowledge of his royal upbringing. He understands royalty and how they think. He understands war, and he understands how soldiers operate, and he understands exactly the things he needs to empower his people, to free them. And this is an old story that is being expressed in a new way that has some synonyms, she's saying, in what comes from what Bashar talked about, a place called Huva. And I think we all understand the archetype of the story, this archetype of being under great oppression, great disempowerment, the miracle of simple things that exist in a very everyday way coming together to assist a great transformation, a great empowerment of a very poorly beat down people. And I mean, you can see this everywhere today. You can see this like in the race riots that are out there. You could see it in women's rights movements. There's all kinds of echoes, in a sense, of that kind of story arc. This all has to go back to the idea that humanity is sleeping and doesn't know that it's asleep. Humanity is in a profound state of disconnection from itself. What you would call sleeping, Summer, is not in fact sleeping, but it is in fact disconnection. And the idea of sleeping is more aggressive in your terms because you're seeing it for how it in fact actually is. It isn't so much sleeping as it is disconnection, because the sleep in a sense is integrated into the natural expression of people who are aware of how life works. And so they live with that level of dreamlike ability integrated into their day-to-day experiences. That's from Sarah. And the reason why she's saying that is because of the whole reason I wanted to talk about this too. Ever since I've been waking up, I've had enormous fears about my own abilities and about just the abilities that all of us have in common that we're not even aware of yet. I don't know if you've ever seen the show Heroes. It's kind of like this idea, sort of like there's like these people who are asleep in a sense their whole life to like who they really are. There's something different about them, but they don't really see it as anything until something extraordinary happens. I know in my own case, the only thing I saw myself was as pretty much just like this big kind of like loser until something actually positively extraordinary happened. And then I started to think differently about myself. Then I started to think, maybe there's a reason why I'm not as good as other people are in the world, and then I don't exactly fit, that I have kind of like a foreign feel, a foreign flavor to like my expression of humanity. It's not like a negative, it's not like a failing, so to speak. It's something that happens in the wake of something positive that is literally unheard of in our world. It's like this stuff doesn't exist. It's like too out of the ordinary for it to like be real until you experience it and recognize that, yeah, you're part of this story. I wanted to bring up a couple examples of what I'm talking about. It's because when you start waking up, there's certain things that can be a little bit uncomfortable. The first one I want to talk about is what I call the weed experience. Why do I call it that? Is because any which way you have it, when you consume marijuana in some sense, it puts you in a kind of relaxed, elevated, and expansive state. I remember the first time I smoked it when I was young. As soon as I went into that elevated state, I remember getting extremely paranoid that I was losing control and that I would just show it in front of my parents, who would never permit me to do that. And so I was just like freaking out in paranoia all the time. Okay, flash forward many years later, after my Kundalini awakening, the exact kind of thing happened to me one day while I was sitting at the computer. I was just sitting there, I was surfing on the web. Something just kind of like dislodged, because all of a sudden my awareness suddenly expanded beyond myself and above myself too. It was like I was lucid in like my life. Almost like you would have like a lucid dream kind of thing, except I'm like this happened when I was awake. The feeling of it felt so like relaxed and so, I don't know, childlike. Like it felt like precious and pure. Everything just feels so clear and everything just feels awake all of a sudden. Kind of like you're asleep like for the whole time. Like you're asleep in a kind of like stuck kind of position, and you live like that your whole life, and all of a sudden it's like kind of dislodge. You're gonna crack out of a little bit, and then you sort of loosen, and then in that loosening you kind of feel what it feels like all around you. It was spherically like 360 degrees around my entire body, my skin. You feel like you have strength. You feel yourself for the first time that you've never felt. It is like an incredible experience. It is like a childlike state, and this is why I call it kind of like the weed experience, is because it feels sort of like how you feel during that experience. You feel kind of like expanded, except unlike the weed experience, it doesn't have like that kind of feeling of like intoxication at all. You feel alive, you feel expanded, but you feel expanded beyond what you define as your sense perception, your sense awareness around you. During that experience, I remember the first thing that came out of my mouth was, oh my God, they're gonna find out, they're gonna find out, they're gonna find out. And I remember feeling only like a little while, like many years later, when I thought about it, I was like, it's sort of like how I felt when I was smoking weed. Like I felt bad being in that state of being. I felt bad like I wasn't supposed to be there. They're gonna find out, right? That I'm like being myself and like dislodging from that kind of experience. I want to bring this up too because I think there can be a lot of feelings of shame, guilt, and fear when people start to wake up. The reason why we're asleep isn't so much what you would think, because in my experience, the reason we're asleep is because we're pushing against ourselves, and we've trained ourselves almost like acrobats, always flipping and contorting our bodies in like unusual, unnatural ways, trying to do like really crazy things to like live our lives. We're pushing against ourselves and we're developing these skills in this inside out, upside down, backwards kind of experience. Because that's like what it's like when you awaken, when you see what people are doing around you, you're like freaked. And I'm not talking about like the Illuminati or like dark cabals. I'm talking about regular everyday people like all around you. You're like, okay, why are you living like that? How come you're hurting yourself in that way? Like in a lot of ways, it's almost like the Special Olympics. It's like you look at people in a kind of incapacitated form that are like compensating with it with fantastic acrobatic feats, like physical triumphs of a sort. And that was kind of like what it felt like. But I remember at that point, like I remember feeling fear, like a lot of fear. Imagine if you could, if you were a drug addict recovering in a society of drug addicts, and you have the first bit of sobriety, and then all around you, everything, the way it's built, the way people live their lives, the whole system, everything is arranged around funding that kind of drug addiction. And when you wake up out of that and you're no longer drugged up and you can finally see things clearly and see how things actually looked, not in an intoxicated, damaged kind of way, you're like freaked out. You're like, where am I going to find help? Where am I going to find people like me? Do I have to bend towards those people? Do I have to live like in fear the rest of my life? Do I have to protect myself from them? Do I have to lie? Do I have to hide? Like, what am I supposed to do, right? It's like you didn't even expect you were going to wake up, but then you did. And it feels terrifying. It's sort of like, who do you think you are that you're not going to be like us? I'm not even trying to I'm not trying to make any arguments or anything like that. I just am not like you guys. Like, I don't want to be like you guys. It kind of paints a target on you, making you seem like you're the bad one, so to speak, because you're different. You're different in a world that is asleep. And like I said, that sleep is aggressive. It's almost like people are kind of drugging themselves with like injury or something like that. It's like a kind of like heavy, dark kind of like experience where people just don't want to wake up from. And so they create a whole sustainable life at kind of like a sleeping kind of level, and they don't realize there's like more of them than they realize. It reminds me of this experience that I heard in abduction lore. This father and son who were both teachers at like a community college or something like that. They both got into their car to make a cross-country trip. Along the trip, they said they both went into like a hypnotic kind of state. When they emerged from that kind of like sleepy kind of state, they realized they had driven like an hour in the wrong direction. And they realized, like, how did we get so far off track? And they're like, where did all the time go? It was like 3 hours or something was just missing. And they're like, okay, well, we better find some place to sleep. So they pulled off the road. They found like a small motel off the side. When they pulled into the driveway, they saw like a few police officers next to cop cars in there. They instantly felt guilty. They kept looking out the window that night over at the police officers in the parking lot, and they both kind of looked at each other knowing with the same kind of feeling inside of them. They're like, why do we both feel so guilty? It's like we didn't do anything wrong. Even though they couldn't remember the experience, that feeling inside of them was still in there. That feeling of this like powerful guilt for some reason. Later on, they recovered the memory, and during that time that they weren't there, they had pulled off to the side of the road in the country somewhere, and there were a number of grays that approached the vehicle. They got into the back of their truck and were jumping around almost like little children. And then there was a hybrid who approached the vehicle and led them to a craft that was like nestled in the woods. During that time, they performed like some kind of medical procedure or something like that, but it returned them to a state of health that they had like when they were younger, both of them, the father and the son. But they also described the feeling in that experience was an incredible sense of peace and love, especially from the tall gray, which was the hybrid. There was this feeling almost like of brotherhood, like a feeling of it, like a relatable kind of like familiar kind of like feeling between them. I don't know if there's anyone else like me out there, but I know there's been lots of times in my life, especially during awakening, where guilt comes up. For us, I think it's specifically because we're different. But this brings me to the point of why I'm talking about this is that feeling of being afraid to be here. When I was mixed up more in the world, like the regular education facilities, I felt like not scared because I was more like them at that point. When I started to be more of myself, when I started to heal, and when I started to clear up, that's when I started getting scared, because the less injury I was kind of drugging myself with, the more I felt kind of like this, like, I don't know, this like intense like sensitivity, this intense like vulnerableness. Whereas if you're just taking a lot of hits all day long, just beating yourself up and talking down yourself, self-criticism, you don't feel anything so much anymore. You just kind of beat yourself up like you're like an old truck or something like that. If you're not open to the spiritual, you can develop incredible like mental faculties, incredible physical fitness, incredible like material wealth and things like that, because you don't have that stuff to worry about, right? It's not actually informing any kind of decision one way or the other. So you can just create very, very 3D experiences, but you're kind of turned off to the higher joy. So what you do is like replace it with a lot of physical development. And when you feel that in comparison, when you see how far people are willing to go in their like darkened unconscious state, it's scary. Like it's really like terrifying. I think the very early stages of awakening are probably the most scary, because most of you is pointed in the exact opposite direction. Everything about you moves and operates in the backwards, inside out, upside down clown academy. And then so when you start to wake up to like naturalness, you're feeling like your little bit of like health inside of you in comparison to the over enormously developed and highly polished state of like darkened unconscious living. When I start talking about my fear, a lot of times that's the first thing that happens, is that people start catalyzing almost automatically and saying, why don't you just do something about it? It's like, I don't think you understand what I'm expressing. You don't understand the magnitude of what I'm expressing. Like, just because this is like a casual video, it doesn't mean there isn't a whole friggin' life behind it. Like, these are just words representing a real experience that you are not having. You're not having the experience, so you have no idea what you're talking about. It's not about courage. This is a complete misunderstanding. And like, it comes back to something that sounds incredibly feminine. It sounds incredibly weak, sappy, and emotional. That's not the way I'm saying it at all. It comes down to falling in love with yourself. Totally. Total embodiment with who you are. It is a state of being without fear, not a state where you're in fear and you have courage to step through it. That's the opposite of that. It is letting go of fear and living your life at that level. And none of you guys are doing that. Believe me, because you would all be perceived as threats to everyone around you, just like what Bashar is talking about. You would have that kind of level of experience to people around you. Some people might have like a certain degree of it, but generally speaking, the kind of projecting I get from people when I start explaining that is precisely the reason I'm frightened in this world, because they're in a state of like injury, perceiving it as a state of heightened health or superiority to me. And it's actually the reverse. No matter what I might look or sound like, it's actually much more the reverse, because the principle of embodying yourself is the state of being fearless. And when you start to do that in the early stages, there's no such thing as strength. You're like naked like a baby. It's like you can't contain any of like the skills or the mind or anything like that. You're just pure. You're just organic. You're just natural. You're just vulnerable. And that is what allows you to flush into yourself. Forever vulnerability too, because you no longer are containing the fear that separates you from that utter vulnerability to all that is. But you have to be open in that sense to receive all the strength and experience that you need to truly be all of who you are. And that's an absolutely transforming experience. It's absolutely vulnerable, but the irony of it, the paradox of it, is that you have the most strength because you're no longer in separation. So you're no longer in injury. But it's like saying like the baby is the strongest you've ever been, because that was the person who had the least amount of resistance. It's like that kind of expression. And I think people, they do not understand, because they're like those robot people that I'm describing. They're like almost like machines just plowing through everything. And this is why the whole planet is like polluted, because we don't actually have any longer like a natural care for ourselves, that we interact with the natural environment in a natural way, and we don't disrespect it in that separation from it. It's not at all like training to be like an astronaut or something like that, and you put yourself through rigors. It's like unlearning all that stuff in a beautifully profound, like epic storytelling way, where you start to see the majesty of your soul expressed and experienced in all the musical, colorful vibrance of what life has to be. And when you're like that, you're opened to that. And that is where your strength can grow inside of you. You don't push it into you. You don't force it out of you. You allow it to come out naturally. But that allowance requires that kind of nakedness. So when you start to open up to that and you feel and see the world around you, yeah, you can be pretty frightened. That's exactly how I feel. Like I feel like when you start to waken up and when you start to loosen up, the first thing I feel is like danger, because I feel what is being lived around me in a kind of scary agreement with all people like in society, to just kind of live in this really hardened kind of sleeping way. I think it can be like really tempting in a lot of ways just to go to sleep like other people, to just like hide this stuff, because I know I have, and I do. I'm still like day to day struggling with like what is right and what is wrong, and like what's real and what's not real. Because it's a lot of this stuff is like I was never taught any of this stuff like previous to my experience. It was like my experience was the teaching, and it was like all just one thing all at once, and I'm like, what is this, right? And then how come there's nobody else? Like what am I the only one? Like what is going on here, right? And then you try to talk to about it, like even with close friends, and they were just like blank faced, like there is nothing there. Like they don't know anything about this stuff. I think a lot of people who might even click on this video, they would just be like the same thing. Like a lot of people just probably won't know what I'm talking about unless they've had those experiences, unless you felt that kind of like chill from society, like where you see the world and it's like this homogenated mass of sleeping people kind of like moving around each other or aggressively pushing through each other. And that's a scary place to be, when you start to be like the first breath of fresh air in like a whole environment of like sickness. It can be incredibly attractive to a lot of people, especially if you are like poisoned with sickness. You can feel the health in that. You can feel the like humility, the clarity, the freshness of it, right? And it can feel like God. It can feel like a spiritual experience. And it is and it isn't, because it's really just experiencing yourself more completely. It's experiencing yourself out of that solidified like sickness, basically. It was another experience too that I had when I was first recovering from just beating myself up like all day long. And it was just that initial feeling of like that nakedness, and hearing the world around me and feeling the world around me for the first time, and seeing like the moving kind of chaos and sadness of it that exists everywhere. And it was frightening. It was absolutely terrifying to me. I felt scared, like with the people I'd known my whole life. I felt suddenly frightened with them. I felt scared enough to do pretty much whatever they wanted me to do, because I was just terrified that if I didn't, they would make my life difficult. And a lot of times people did on instinct and for the most positive reasons. That's why I want to like express this stuff, because a lot of like what is actual health is seen as some kind of like unnaturalness, some kind of sickness, some kind of brokenness. And it isn't. It's a projection from the world around. It's like a horrible thing to suddenly say something of like health and everyone reacts to it as if it was like sickness, as if it was psychosis or something like that, when it wasn't. It's like the first breath of like fresh air. And I've experienced it both ways, but I've always been the same person. So on one end, the very same people are hating me for being one thing on this side. They're loving me for what I contribute on the other side, because it suits their way of seeing things. But it's one piece. So the very same thing that you're in love with is like one of the things that you're probably most frightened of. And you don't see it, because it shows you things about yourself that you would never want to see or know are actually true. And that's how it actually is. I'm still fighting in my mind things that happened like 10 years ago, like 15 years ago, from people who just didn't understand me, people who will never understand me, because it's not their story to like understand me. And I just have to like recognize that and just like let that go as best as I can. The worst thing is when I'm still conflicted about it and what they say contains some truth, and it just goes into like years of like analysis about it, like pulling apart, looking at every little thing. And Sarah's saying that's the projection, that's how it works, that's why it's so intoxicating to those people, because there is enough truth in it to like fight to death for, Sarah's saying. And so that's why it convinces you even this deeply, even after seeing the profound experiences that I've showed you, you still doubt that what you're seeing is the reality. But like it absolutely is. Like it absolutely is. And it's like, yeah, you need to put that out there so that people can understand, because like it's not pleasant. Like it's not pleasant at all when you wake up, and then it's like your own support system turns against you and they start fighting you and chewing you to death in the name of what's right, and are supported by like all the institutions and everything in society. It's absolutely the most like dangerous and scary kind of place that you can possibly be. It's like that level of profound lostness in society, that kind of level of profound separation. It's like a drive in society to like push through you as if you're the cause of everything that's wrong in their life. And finally they have that valve to like release the pain that they're in for like even a temporary second. It's absolutely terrifying and torturous to have people out there who would just like totally assault you because of who you are, because they just don't understand, because they just don't get it, and because they can't see that they're dark and backwards themselves. Like, yeah, I have to talk about this stuff because it's bad. Like, it's like really black and ugly out there, and it can only exist like that in a state of like that kind of unconsciousness. This is not a healthy world. We're not a healthy species. We're like sick, black, and polarized. The idea of psychopaths rising up, that's funded by the sickness we're all in. No matter how white picket fence your house is, you're part of that. It's part of that sickness. You just don't see it. You're just painting over a slum and saying it's paradise. It's not. That's not what it is inside and out. It's not what it is universally. It's very sick and imbalanced, and in that, all kinds of sicknesses grow. And the worst kind of things are funded by all of us, even though we say we're fighting those criminals or something. We're not, because our nature that we lie to ourselves about is funding them. It's supporting sickness. It's not healing anything. My name is Summer. If you like these videos, please like, share, subscribe. Leave your feedback down below, because I know awakening, especially if you had like profound experiences, if you are profoundly unique, then you probably have like a lot of really challenging experiences, things that give you pause, that give you doubt in yourself. And it can be like a really scary place to wake up in. But if you're scared, at least you're not as scary as the people who are completely confident in the way they're living and completely happy with themselves, so it seems. Have a great day, guys.